10 mail-order brides lined up, but the mountain man pointed at her and said, "That one." The September sun beat down mercilessly on Willow Creek's dusty main street as the stagecoach rattled to a stop outside the Mercantile. Word had spread quickly through the settlement. The mail-order brides had arrived. Shopkeepers abandoned their counters, farmers left their wagons half-loaded, and even Reverend Patterson emerged from his study, drawn by the unusual commotion. Eleanor Hartwell was the last to descend from the coach, her sturdy frame requiring careful negotiation of the narrow steps. At 24, she had long accepted certain truths about herself. She was short, barely 5 feet tall. She was heavy-set, her body shaped by years of hard farm work rather than the fashionable corsets that cinched her traveling companions into hourglass figures. Her skin, browned by the sun during her childhood laboring in her father's fields, stood in stark contrast to the porcelain complexions of the other young women who now gathered nervously on the wooden sidewalk. Mrs. Dalton, the mayor's wife who had organized this matchmaking event, counted heads and frowned. 10 brides for 12 men, she announced cheerfully, as if discussing livestock at auction. Ladies, please form a line here. Gentlemen will arrive shortly. Eleanor instinctively moved to the end of the line, positioning herself beside a rain barrel where she might escape notice. The other women, Catherine, Margaret, Elizabeth, and the rest, preened and whispered amongst themselves, adjusting ribbons and smoothing already perfect hair. They had dressed in their finest traveling costumes, each hoping to catch the eye of a prosperous rancher or established merchant. "Did you see the size of this territory?" Catherine, a willowy blonde, exclaimed. "Why, back in Philadelphia, I never imagined such vast spaces existed." "I heard some of these men own hundreds of acres," Margaret added, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Imagine being mistress of such an estate." Eleanor said nothing. She had no illusions about why she was here. After her father's death left her orphaned and penniless, her uncle had made his position clear. He would not support a useless mouth who had failed to secure a husband by her advanced age. The mail-order bride service had seemed her only option, though the agent had looked doubtful when she'd applied, suggesting she lower her expectations considerably. The sound of approaching boots drew everyone's attention. The homesteaders and ranchers arrived in a group, most having traveled from their isolated properties specifically for this event. They were weathered men, their faces creased by sun and hard living, their clothes clean but worn. They lined up opposite the women, and Mrs. Dalton began her introductions. "Mr. Patterson, no relation to the Reverend, owns 200 acres of prime farmland east of town. Mr. Hutchins runs cattle. Mr. Morrison just established a successful freight business." The selection process began with an awkwardness that gradually gave way to business-like efficiency. The men would approach, ask brief questions about domestic skills, and make their choices. One by one, the prettier girls were claimed. Catherine went to Mr. Patterson, Margaret to Mr. Hutchins. Elizabeth, a petite brunette with dimples, charmed the freight operator within minutes. As each woman was chosen, they moved to stand beside their intended, relief evident in their expressions. Eleanor remained at her post by the rain barrel, watching the numbers dwindle. She noticed how the men's eyes skipped over her, how they seemed to look through her as if she were part of the scenery. When only 4 women remained, a portly rancher named Cletus Boone swaggered down the line. His breath reeked of whiskey even from a distance. He looked over the remaining choices with obvious disappointment, his gaze settling briefly on Eleanor before moving away. "Why would they send one like that?" he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hell, I could do better with a trained mule." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's face burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the dusty street, fighting back tears. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She had endured worse humiliations, her uncle's constant criticism, the pitying looks from church ladies, the careful distance young men maintained at social gatherings. Boone eventually selected one of the remaining 3 women, a nervous girl named Sarah, who looked on the verge of tears as she joined him. Then another man chose, leaving only Eleanor and a woman named Prudence, who was nearly 40, and had admitted to being widowed 3 times under mysterious circumstances. "Well," Mrs. Dalton said with forced brightness, "I'm certain we can find suitable arrangements for you both. Perhaps as housekeepers or—" "Hold on!" The voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Everyone turned toward the mountains rising beyond the town's edge, where a tall figure had emerged from the tree line. He moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to rough terrain, his buckskin clothing marking him as a mountain man. His dark hair hung to his shoulders, threaded with silver despite his appearing no older than 40. A well-maintained rifle rested in the crook of his arm. "That's James Blackwood," someone whispered. "Hasn't been to town in near about 2 years. Thought he'd sworn off women after his wife left him. That was 15 years ago at least. Figured he'd die alone up there in his cabin." James Blackwood ignored the whispers. He walked past the matched couples without a glance, his weathered face unreadable. When he reached the line of remaining women, he stopped. His examination was methodical and unhurried. He looked at Prudence first, taking in her calculating expression and the hardness around her mouth. Then he turned to Eleanor. Their eyes met, and Eleanor was startled by what she saw there, not disgust or dismissal, but something like recognition. His gaze didn't linger on her body with judgment. Instead, he seemed to be looking deeper, searching for something the others had missed. "You know how to work?" His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. Eleanor found her voice with effort. "Yes, sir. I can cook, sew, garden. I know how to preserve food, make soap, tend chickens. I can read and cipher. I'm stronger than I look." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Can you shoot?" She hesitated. "I've shot vermin on the farm, nothing larger." "Can you handle solitude, long winters with no company but your own thoughts?" This question felt more important somehow. Eleanor considered it seriously. "I've spent most of my life feeling alone even in a crowded room, sir. I reckon actual solitude might be an improvement." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or approval. He nodded once, then turned to Mrs. Dalton. "That one," he said, pointing at Eleanor. "I'll take her." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Then the whispers began, rushing through the crowd like wind through wheat. "He can't be serious. Why would he choose her? James Blackwood could have his pick. What's he thinking?" One of the matched brides, a girl named Harriet, spoke up with cruel clarity. "Why would you choose the fat one when you could have any of them?" She gestured to the women already claimed, as if offering them up. James turned slowly to face her. His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes made Harriet step back. "Because," he said quietly, his words carrying in the stunned silence, "she's the only one who didn't look at me like I'm a prize to win. She looked at me like I'm a man, a person, and that tells me more about her character than a pretty face ever could." He returned his attention to Eleanor, extending his hand. "I live 3 hours into the mountains. Life there is hard. Winters are brutal. You'll work dawn to dusk most days. I can't promise you comfort or easy living, but I can promise you respect, protection, and an honest partnership. If that interests you, come with me. If not, I'll leave you here with my blessing and no hard feelings." Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand. This wasn't the romantic proposal she had once daydreamed about as a girl. There were no declarations of love, no promises of devotion. But there was something more valuable: honesty. James Blackwood wasn't trying to charm her or deceive her. He was offering her exactly what she'd hoped for: a chance at a real life, earned through work and mutual respect. She placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but gentle. "I'll come," she said. Mrs. Dalton bustled forward with papers to sign, contracts to witness. The process took less than 10 minutes. Eleanor had arrived in Willow Creek with a single carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. She collected it now, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. As they left town, she heard the whispers resume behind them. "Give it a month. She'll come running back." Poor man, probably desperate for any help up there. What a waste. Imagine choosing that when Eleanor forced herself not to look back. Whatever awaited her in the mountains, it had to be better than the contempt she was leaving behind. They walked in silence for the first hour, following a narrow trail that climbed steadily upward through dense forest. James set a pace that was challenging but manageable, occasionally glancing back to ensure Eleanor was keeping up. She was grateful for his consideration, though she suspected he'd adjusted his usual speed for her benefit. The carpet bag grew heavier with each step, but Eleanor refused to complain. She shifted it from hand to hand, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing and the placement of her feet on the uneven ground. Sweat soaked through her traveling dress and her legs burned with exertion, but she pushed forward. "Need to rest?" James asked when they reached a small clearing. Eleanor wanted to say yes. Her lungs ached and blisters were forming in her boots, but something stubborn rose up in her. "I can make it if you can." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "There's a creek about half a mile ahead. We'll stop there." The creek, when they reached it, was a ribbon of crystalline water tumbling over smooth stones. James knelt to drink, then gestured for Eleanor to do the same. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. "We're about halfway," James said, settling against a tree trunk. "This is a good place to talk honestly." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "About what?" "About expectations." He pulled a piece of jerky from his pack and offered her half. "My first wife was named Catherine. Beautiful woman by any standard. Golden hair, delicate features, educated. We married when I was 25, full of romantic notions. Brought her up to the cabin thinking love would conquer all." He paused, chewing thoughtfully. She hated it. Hated the isolation, the hard work, the lack of society. Lasted 2 years before she left one spring, took everything of value she could carry. I found a note saying she'd gone back east, that she'd made a mistake marrying a savage. That was 15 years ago. Eleanor absorbed this information. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me a valuable lesson. Pretty faces and romantic feelings aren't enough to sustain a partnership in this life. What matters is resilience, practical skills, and a willingness to work as a team. That's why I chose you today. Because I'm practical." The words tasted bitter. "Because you're real." James met her eyes directly. Those other women, they were playing parts, performing what they thought men wanted to see. But you were just yourself. That takes courage, especially after the way they treated you. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "You're saying this is a business arrangement. I'm saying it's an honest arrangement. I need a partner, not a decoration. Someone who can survive if something happens to me. Someone I can rely on." He hesitated, then added, "And maybe over time, it could become something more. Or maybe not. Either way, you'll be treated with respect. You'll have a home, food, protection. You'll be an equal partner in everything we build." It wasn't a declaration of love, but after a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed, equality sounded like its own kind of treasure. "What would you need me to do?" Eleanor asked. "In practical terms? The cabin needs tending while I'm out hunting and trapping. Food preservation is critical. We need enough supplies to last through winters when we might not see another soul for months. The garden needs constant attention. There's spinning, weaving, soap making, all the work that keeps us alive." He smiled slightly. "I do the hunting and heavy labor. You manage the homestead. Together, we survive." "And you teach me how to live in the mountains?" "Everything I know. How to track, shoot, dress game, how to read weather signs, find water, identify edible plants. By the time winter comes, you'll be as capable as any mountain woman who's lived here her whole life." Eleanor took a deep breath. This was more than she'd dared hope for. Not romance, but respect. Not love, but partnership. And the promise of becoming someone stronger, more capable, more valued than she'd ever been. "Then I'll work hard," she said. "I won't disappoint you." "I don't believe you will." James stood, extending his hand to help her up. "Come on, let's get you home." The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached James's property. The cabin sat in a small clearing backed against a cliff face, with forest spreading out before it like a green sea. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, sturdily built from hewn logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows that caught the fading light. "Built it myself," James said, noticing her examination. "Took 3 years to get it right. The cliff protects us from the worst of the north winds. Creek's just through those trees. You'll hear it at night. The garden's on the south side where it gets the best sun." He led her inside, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. The single main room was organized with military precision. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with iron cookware hanging from hooks. A sturdy table occupied the center of the room, flanked by 2 hand-hewn chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, tools, and surprisingly, several dozen books. A ladder led to a loft that appeared to serve as sleeping quarters. "It's wonderful," Eleanor said softly. James looked surprised. "It's just a cabin. It's clean, organized. Someone takes pride in it." She ran her hand along the smooth table surface. "This is quality work." He seemed pleased by her observation. "I'll sleep down here by the fire tonight. The loft is yours. There's extra blankets in the chest. Tomorrow, I'll start teaching you the land." That night, lying in the loft on a surprisingly comfortable rope bed, Eleanor listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. An owl hooted nearby. Something rustled in the underbrush outside. The creek provided a constant murmur. Below, she could hear James banking the fire, preparing for sleep. She had done it. Against all odds, she had escaped her uncle's house, survived the humiliation of the selection process, and arrived at a place where she might, just might, be valued for who she was rather than what she looked like. Eleanor pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The next months passed in a blur of constant learning. James proved to be a patient but exacting teacher. He woke her before dawn each morning to check trap lines, teaching her to identify animal tracks and read signs in the forest. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to find water even in dry conditions, how to move silently through the woods. "The mountains are beautiful but unforgiving," he explained one crisp October morning as they skinned a deer he'd shot. "Every mistake has consequences. Running out of food in January means starvation. Failing to maintain your shelter means freezing. Getting lost means death. There's no room for carelessness." Eleanor proved an apt student, absorbing information with the desperate focus of someone who understood the stakes. Her hands, already work-hardened from farm labor, adapted quickly to new tasks. She learned to dress game without flinching, to preserve meat in the smokehouse, to tan hides until they were soft and supple. The work was brutal. Her muscles ached constantly those first weeks, and she fell into bed each night too exhausted to even dream. But gradually, her body adapted. She grew stronger, more confident in her movements. The blisters on her hands hardened into calluses. Her breathing came easier during the long hikes. James watched her progress with quiet approval, offering corrections when needed, but increasingly trusting her to work independently. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. He would hunt and trap while she managed the homestead, but they worked together on larger projects. They repaired the cabin's roof before the first snow. They built a new chicken coop and acquired 6 hens from a trapper passing through. They worked side by side in the garden, harvesting and preserving everything they could. One evening in late November, as they sat by the fire after a long day of butchering and smoking meat, James surprised her with a question. You ever regret coming here? Eleanor considered her response carefully. Do you want the polite answer or the honest one? Always honest. That's our deal. Then no, not once. She looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of his that had torn on a bramble. Some days are hard. My body hurts. I miss things about civilization. Real coffee, newspapers, music. But I don't miss feeling worthless. I don't miss being invisible. James nodded slowly. You're not invisible here. No, she agreed. Here, I matter. The work I do keeps us alive. That's worth more than any compliment on a pretty dress. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. I judged you wrong that first day, he finally said. How so? I thought you'd be competent, useful, a good work partner. He glanced at her, and Eleanor was startled by the warmth in his eyes. I didn't expect to enjoy your company so much. You're clever. Funny when you let yourself be. You notice things, small details that make life better. Eleanor's heart stuttered. This was the closest James had come to expressing personal affection. I notice because you've made me feel safe enough to stop worrying about survival every second. That's a gift. Then we're both getting more than we bargained for. The first snow came the next week, transforming the landscape into a pristine wilderness. They were snowed in for 3 days, which James said was mild compared to what was coming. Eleanor discovered she didn't mind the isolation. In fact, with supplies laid in and no urgent tasks demanding attention, those days had a peaceful quality she'd never experienced before. They talked during those long evenings, really talked, sharing stories and opinions in a way Eleanor had never been able to with anyone. James told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about learning to trap from his grandfather, about the wanderlust that had driven him ever westward. Eleanor shared memories of her father, the farm that had been lost, the uncle who had made her feel like a burden. He was wrong, James said firmly when she finished, about you being worthless. A man who can't see value in hard work and steady character is a fool. Most men seem to share his opinion. Most men are fools. He smiled then, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. Present company accepted, of course. Eleanor laughed, and the sound surprised her. When had laughter become so rare in her life? When had she stopped allowing herself simple joy? December brought the true test of their preparations. A blizzard rolled down from the high peaks with unprecedented fury, burying the cabin under 6 feet of snow and trapping them inside for nearly 2 weeks. The wind screamed like a living thing, and even with the fire roaring constantly, frost formed on the inside of the windows. They rationed their movements to conserve heat, spending most of their time near the hearth. Eleanor read aloud from James's books, adventure tales by James Fenimore Cooper, poetry by William Wordsworth, even a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that felt eerily appropriate. On the 5th day, the chimney began to smoke badly, filling the cabin with choking fumes. Ice dam, James said tersely. I need to clear it or we'll suffocate. You can't go up there in this storm. We don't have a choice. He was already pulling on his heaviest furs. Keep the fire low until I give the signal. If I'm not back in an hour. Don't say that. James paused at the door, meeting her frightened eyes. Eleanor, if something happens to me, you know what to do. Supplies are marked. The trap lines are memorized. Come spring, you can make it to Willow Creek. I don't want to survive without you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unintended meaning. James crossed back to her, placing his rough hands on her shoulders. You will survive, he said firmly, because you're strong, because you're capable, because I've taught you well. But nothing's going to happen. I've done this before. He squeezed her shoulders once, then disappeared into the howling white chaos beyond the door. The next hour was the longest of Eleanor's life. She kept the fire barely flickering, straining to hear any sound over the storm. She counted her heartbeats, recited poetry, prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. When she heard the thump on the roof signaling success, She nearly collapsed with relief. James staggered back inside 20 minutes later, so covered in snow he looked like a moving drift. Eleanor rushed to help him out of his frozen clothes, her hands shaking as she worked. His lips were blue, his fingers stiff and white. "Frostbite," he mumbled. "Need warmth." Eleanor stoked the fire back to full heat, then made a decision. She stripped off her own clothes down to her shift and pulled James close, using her body heat to warm him. She wrapped them both in every blanket they had, holding him tight as violent shivers racked his frame. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Don't you dare leave me alone here." Gradually, painfully, warmth returned to his extremities. The dangerous white patches on his fingers faded to red, then to normal color. His breathing steadied, and only when she was certain he was out of danger did Eleanor allow herself to cry. Great, gasping sobs of relief and fear, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. James pulled her closer, his arms steady now. "I'm all right. You saved me. You saved us first. The chimney, we saved each other. That's what partners do." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped together in the cocoon of blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. And somewhere, in that intimate darkness, something fundamental shifted between them. The practical arrangement they'd agreed to was transforming into something neither had anticipated. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the mountains. The blizzards became less frequent, the cold less brutal. By late February, James could venture out regularly again to check trap lines and hunt for fresh meat. Eleanor's confidence grew with each passing week. She could now handle a rifle competently, track small game, and navigate the immediate area around the cabin without getting lost. But the real change was in how they were with each other. The crisis during the blizzard had stripped away the careful professional distance they'd maintained. Now, James would catch her hand as she passed, holding it for a moment before releasing her. Eleanor found herself touching his shoulder when she poured coffee, letting her fingers linger. They sat closer by the fire in the evenings. Their conversations grew more personal, more vulnerable. One evening in early March, as melting snow dripped from the eaves, James spoke into the comfortable silence. "I need to tell you something. D." Eleanor looked up from her sewing, concerned by his serious tone. "When I chose you in Willow Creek, I told myself it was purely practical. You seemed capable, level-headed, someone who could handle this life." He paused, struggling with words. "I convinced myself I was past wanting more. That partnership was enough. And now?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Now I realize I was lying to myself." He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "Eleanor, somewhere between teaching you to shoot and watching you preserve venison and listening to you read poetry by firelight, I fell in love with you. Not because you're convenient or capable, though you are both, but because of who you are, your courage, your humor, the way you see beauty in this harsh place, the way you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a shelter." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "James, I know this wasn't our agreement. I know I promised only respect and partnership. If you don't feel the same, nothing has to change. We can continue as we are. But I needed you to know the truth. I love you." Eleanor set aside her sewing with shaking hands. "That day in Willow Creek when you chose me, I told myself not to hope for more, to be grateful for respect and a home and meaningful work. And I was grateful. I am grateful." She cupped his weathered face in her palms. "But yes, James, I love you too. I think I started falling that very first day, when you looked at me like I was worth something, and I've been falling deeper every day since." His kiss was gentle, reverent, nothing like the fumbling encounters she'd heard giggling girls describe. This was better, the kiss of a man who valued her, who saw her fully and loved what he saw. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "Marry me," James said. properly, not as a business arrangement but as husband and wife in truth. Hot-board tea. "We are married," Eleanor laughed. "We signed papers. Legal papers. I want to marry you before God and anyone who will witness it. I want you to wear my ring and know beyond doubt that you're cherished." Eleanor thought of that day in Willow Creek, standing at the end of the line while others were chosen first. She thought of every moment in her life when she'd felt less than unwanted, invisible. And she thought of the man kneeling before her now, who had seen past all that to the person she really was. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you again, as many times as you want." They made the journey to Willow Creek as soon as the mountain passes were navigable. The town had changed little in the months since Eleanor's arrival, but she felt like a different person walking down that familiar street. She stood straighter now, moved with confidence earned through hard-won competence. The whispers started as soon as they were spotted. "That's the fat one Blackwood took. Look at her, dressed like a man practically. Poor thing. Must be a hard life up there." Eleanor ignored them, her hands secure in James's as they made their way to the church. Reverend Patterson agreed to perform a proper ceremony, and Mrs. Dalton bustled about finding witnesses. The wedding was simple. Eleanor wore a dress she'd sewn herself from doeskin, practical but beautiful in its own way. James had traded for a simple gold band, which he slipped onto her finger with steady hands. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her thoroughly, earning scandalized gasps from the assembled witnesses. As they left the church, they encountered several of the brides who'd been chosen before Eleanor that day in September. Margaret looked hollow-eyed and exhausted, her fine dress hanging loose on a frame that had shed considerable weight. Sarah, who'd gone with the brutish Cletus Boone, wore long sleeves despite the warm day, covering bruises Eleanor suspected. "Eleanor," Margaret said hesitantly, "I wanted to, that is, I'm sorry, for how we treated you that day." "It's forgotten," Eleanor said, meaning it. "No, please let me finish. We were so certain we knew what mattered. Beauty, refinement, catching the richest man." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I married Mr. Patterson. 200 acres, they said. They didn't mention the debts, the failing crops, the way he drinks himself unconscious most nights. I've written my family begging to come home, but there's no money for passage." Catherine appeared then, her golden hair disheveled, her dress stained. "I'm leaving," she announced, "going back east as soon as I can scrape together the fare. This life, these men, they're not what we were promised." "I'm sorry you're unhappy," Eleanor said gently. And she was, despite everything. "Don't be." Catherine looked at her with something like envy. "You got what we all wanted without realizing it. A man who values you. A partnership built on respect. We were too busy chasing fantasy to recognize reality when it stood before us." As they left town, James asked quietly, "Do you ever wish things had been different? That you'd been chosen first, gotten an easier life?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. She thought about her calloused hands, her wind-chapped skin, the scar on her forearm from a kitchen mishap. She thought about the brutal work, the isolation, the constant struggle against nature. Then she thought about waking up each morning knowing she was valued, about the pride she felt in her competence, about James's arms around her at night, his steady presence beside her, about building something real and lasting with her own two hands. "Not for a moment," she said firmly. "Those women got chosen first, but I got chosen right." Spring exploded across the mountains in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Eleanor worked in the expanded garden, planting seeds they'd saved from the previous year. James had taught her to select the strongest plants for seed, ensuring each generation would be better adapted to the harsh climate. She was on her knees in the turned earth when the wave of nausea hit. Eleanor barely made it to the edge of the garden before losing her breakfast. James was beside her instantly, supporting her, his face creased with worry. "Are you ill? Did you eat something?" "I'm not ill," Eleanor wiped her mouth, laughing despite the queasiness. At least, not in the way you mean. Understanding dawned slowly across his face. You're certain? As certain as I can be without a doctor. Though I suppose Mrs. Patterson would know better than most. She smiled at his stunned expression. We're going to have a baby, James. He pulled her close, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. A baby? God, Eleanor, are you happy about this? Terrified, she admitted. But yes, happy. The pregnancy progressed through the summer months. Eleanor's body, already strong from mountain life, adapted well to the changes. She continued her work with only minor adjustments, though James became almost comically overprotective, trying to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup. I'm pregnant, not infirm, Eleanor would laugh, waving him off. Women have been doing this work for centuries while carrying children. Not my wife, not if I can help it. His tenderness during those months was a revelation. He would rub her aching back in the evenings, prepare special foods when her appetite wavered, talk to her growing belly as if the child could already hear. He began carving a cradle from cedar wood, working on it for hours with infinite patience. In October, nearly a year after their arrival, Eleanor went into labor. James had arranged for Mrs. Patterson to stay at the cabin for the final weeks, despite Eleanor's protests that mountain women had been birthing babies alone for generations. Not you, James said firmly. Not if there's any other option. The labor was long and difficult. Mrs. Patterson later told James it had been touch and go for a while, that she'd feared losing both mother and child. But Eleanor, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, fought through the pain with grim determination. When dawn broke the next morning, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Eleanor held the tiny, perfect creature and wept, not from pain or exhaustion, but from overwhelming joy. She's beautiful, James whispered, his own eyes wet as he cradled them both. Just like her mother. She's strong, Eleanor corrected, like both of us. They named her Catherine Rose. Catherine after James's mother, Rose after Eleanor's. The baby thrived in the mountain air, growing plump and healthy despite the rustic conditions. Eleanor marveled at how naturally motherhood came to her, though she suspected it helped that James was an equal partner in caring for their daughter. You're not like other men I've known, Eleanor observed one evening as she watched James walk the cabin floor with a fussy Catherine, singing softly. Most wouldn't dream of helping with an infant. Most men are fools, James replied, using his favorite phrase. This is my daughter. Why wouldn't I help care for her? When Catherine was 3 months old, they made another trip to Willow Creek for supplies. The town had continued to grow, new families arriving with each wave of western expansion. Eleanor carried Catherine in a sling James had fashioned from soft leather, the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. The stares began immediately, but they felt different now. Less mocking, more curious. That's Eleanor Blackwood, she heard someone whisper. Came out here as a mail-order bride, lives up in the mountains year-round. Heard she can shoot as well as any man. Look how healthy that baby is. Whatever she's doing, it's working. In the Mercantile, Eleanor encountered a new group of mail-order brides who'd arrived just that week. They huddled together nervously, eyeing the rough frontier men who'd come to look them over. Eleanor saw herself in their anxious faces, particularly in one girl who stood apart from the others, heavy-set and uncertain. On impulse, Eleanor approached her. It's frightening, isn't it, not knowing what's ahead? The girl nodded, close to tears. I don't think anyone will choose me. I don't look like the others. Maybe not, but the right person won't care about that. Eleanor shifted Catherine in her arms. The man I married chose me last that day. Everyone thought he was mad, but he saw something the others missed. That I was strong, capable, willing to work hard. That mattered more than conventional beauty. Did you fall in love? Eleanor smiled. Eventually, but we built friendship and respect first. That was the foundation everything else grew from. She glanced at James, who was negotiating with the storekeeper. Find someone who values you for who you are, not what you look like. Everything else follows from that. As they prepared to leave town, Mayor Dalton stopped them. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood, a moment of your time? They turned, curious. The town council has been discussing our growing population, the mayor said. We need experienced guides and hunters to help new families establish themselves. Your reputation in the mountains is well known, Mr. Blackwood. We'd like to offer you a contract, part-time work helping settlers learn the land, good pay, and it would help the community considerably. James looked at Eleanor, letting her read the question in his eyes. It would mean more income, less isolation, a chance to be part of something larger, but it would also mean changes to their carefully balanced life. What do you think? He asked her directly, valuing her opinion as he always had. Eleanor considered. A year ago, she would have been too insecure to voice her thoughts. Now she spoke without hesitation. I think we could help people. Teach them what you taught me, how to survive and even thrive in this landscape. We have knowledge worth sharing. She smiled. But only if we can do it on our terms. We choose when and how much. The mountains remain our home. Agreed, the mayor said quickly. Whatever terms you set. They accepted the contract, beginning a new chapter. Over the following months, James and Eleanor, working as a team, helped dozens of new families learn the skills they needed. Eleanor taught the women food preservation, plant identification, basic wilderness medicine. James worked with the men on hunting, trapping, and building. They became something of legends in the growing community, the mountain couple who defied expectations. When people told their story, they focused on the dramatic moment when James had chosen Eleanor despite all odds. But Eleanor knew the real story was subtler and more beautiful. Two people who'd found each other not through destiny or fate, but through honest evaluation of what truly mattered. Years after he married, the obese bride. Everyone mocked. They came, crawling back, begging the morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Ridge's main street as townsfolk gathered outside the weathered chapel. They weren't there to celebrate. They came to witness what they called the spectacle of the decade. Thomas Bridger stood at the altar in his finest buckskin jacket, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. At 32, he'd spent 15 years in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beaver and trading with native tribes. His fortune, built pelt by pelt, made him the wealthiest man for 300 miles. Yet today, whispers filled the chapel like poisonous smoke. Look at her, Mrs. Catherine Harding hissed to her daughter Elizabeth, not bothering to lower her voice. How does she even fit through the door? Margaret Walsh walked down the aisle alone. Her father had died 3 winters past and her mother 2 months after. At 24, she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her considerable size. Her dress, sewn by her own skilled hands, fit perfectly, a feat of engineering and artistry that no one bothered to appreciate. Her face, round and soft, held intelligent brown eyes that noticed everything, including the cruel smirks and pointing fingers. The Reverend rushed through the ceremony, embarrassed to be presiding over what the town considered a farce. When Thomas lifted Margaret's veil, he saw tears threatening to fall from her eyes. He gently wiped them away and whispered, "Don't give them the satisfaction." He kissed her softly, then turned to face the congregation. The chapel had fallen silent, waiting for some acknowledgement of the absurdity they all perceived. Thomas said nothing. He simply took Margaret's hand and led her outside to the wagon loaded with supplies for their journey into the mountains. 6 months, someone shouted from the crowd. I give it 6 months before he realizes his mistake. More like 6 weeks once the honeymoon food runs out, another voice added, followed by cruel laughter. Thomas helped Margaret onto the wagon seat with gentle care, climbed up beside her, and snapped the reins. As Silver Ridge disappeared behind them, Margaret finally spoke. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you choose me? You could have any woman in 3 territories." Thomas guided the horses onto the mountain trail before answering. 3 years ago, I came to town with a wagon full of pelts. Young Billy Henderson had broken his leg, and his mother was beside herself. You were the only one who stopped your own work to help. Spent 2 days nursing that boy while his ma caught up on sleep. You didn't know I was watching from across the street." He paused, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Last winter, I saw you give half your firewood to the widow Peterson when she ran short. This spring, you taught 3 children to read when their parents couldn't afford the schoolmaster's fees. You think I don't know who you are, Margaret? You think I married you out of pity or desperation?" Margaret wiped her eyes. "Then why didn't you court me properly? Why this sudden wedding announcement?" "Because," Thomas said, his jaw tightening, "I heard Catherine Harding organizing her Ugliest Woman contest for the summer festival. She already had you marked as the winner. I wasn't going to let you endure that humiliation. This way, you're my wife. Under my protection, anyone who insults you insults me." Margaret stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. "You married me to save me from embarrassment?" "I married you because I've been in love with you for 3 years, Thomas corrected. The timing was strategic. The choice was always my heart. Thomas's cabin sat in a valley surrounded by pine-covered peaks with a clear stream running past the front door. It was larger than Margaret expected. 2 rooms with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out on wilderness that stretched forever. "It's not much," Thomas said, carrying her trunk inside, "but it's safe, solid, and it's ours." Margaret walked through the space, noting the organized chaos of a bachelor's existence. Furs were stacked in one corner, awaiting processing. Trapping equipment hung on wall pegs. The kitchen area was functional, but showed signs of neglect. A man who cooked only to survive. "I can work with this," she said, rolling up her sleeves. Over the following weeks, Margaret transformed the cabin. She organized the furs by quality and type, creating an inventory system that shocked Thomas with its efficiency. She established a proper kitchen, a workspace for leather treatment, and a small office area where Thomas's chaotic record-keeping became systematic ledgers. But her greatest contribution came from her mind for business. One evening, as they reviewed his trading records, Margaret frowned at the numbers. "You're selling to the trading post in Silver Ridge. And to the Hudson's Bay Company factor when he comes through," Thomas confirmed. "Thomas, you're losing 60% of your profit. The trading post marks up your furs 300% when they ship them to St. Louis. Hudson's Bay isn't much better." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began calculating. "What if we bypassed the middlemen entirely, shipped directly to the furriers in St. Louis and New Orleans?" Thomas leaned over her shoulder, watching her pencil fly across the page. "The shipping costs alone would eat the difference. Not if we consolidated shipments. Not if we recruited other trappers to pool their furs with ours. For a small commission, of course. We could organize regular shipments, establish direct relationships with the big furriers, cut out 2 layers of profit-taking." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Thomas, we could build something bigger than just trapping and selling. We could create a trading network." He studied her calculations, then studied her face. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about everything," Margaret admitted. "I spent most of my life watching Silver Ridge operate, seeing who succeeded and why. I watched my father's mercantile fail because he couldn't adapt to changing markets. I studied what worked and what didn't. I just never had the opportunity to put that knowledge to use." Thomas kissed her forehead. "You have the opportunity now, and the capital to make it happen." The first year of their marriage was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret wrote letters to furriers in St. Louis, introducing their services and offering better quality furs at more competitive prices. She created standardized grading systems, ensuring consistency that buyers could trust. She negotiated payment terms that protected them from the notoriously fickle fur market. Thomas, meanwhile, began recruiting independent trappers throughout the territory. He offered them fair prices, better than the trading posts, but still profitable for the partnership, and guaranteed prompt payment. Word spread quickly among the mountain men. Thomas Bridger and his wife paid fair and paid on time. By autumn of 1817, they shipped their first consolidated load, 2 wagons of prime beaver pelts, fox furs, and bear hides directly to a furrier in St. Louis. The profit from that single shipment exceeded Thomas's entire previous year's earnings. Margaret proved to be a natural at correspondence and relationship building. Her letters to buyers were professional, charming, and persuasive. She anticipated market trends, adjusted their trapping priorities accordingly, and built a reputation for reliability that money couldn't buy. But success bred new challenges. In spring of 1818, Jacob Morrison, who ran the Silver Ridge trading post, showed up at their cabin with 3 armed men. "You're ruining my business, Bridger," Morrison growled. "Every trapper in the territory is selling to you instead of me." Thomas stepped out of the cabin, rifle in hand. "I'm offering them better prices. That's called commerce, Morrison." "That's called theft. You're stealing my livelihood." "No," Margaret's voice came from the doorway. She stepped out, showing no fear of Morrison's armed men. "You've been stealing from the trappers for years with your exploitative prices. We're simply offering them fair value for their work. If you can't compete, that's not our problem. That's yours." Morrison's face reddened. "You think you're clever, don't you, fat sow? You think you can hide up here in the mountains and play businesswoman?" Before Thomas could respond, Margaret continued calmly. "Mr. Morrison, we've done nothing illegal or unethical. We've built our business through quality, fairness, and hard work. If you'd like to remain competitive, I suggest you adjust your business model accordingly. Now please leave our property." Morrison glared at them, then spat on the ground. "This isn't over." As they rode away, Thomas turned to Margaret. That was brave and stupid. He had 3 armed men. "And we have integrity, quality, and 50 trappers who depend on us," Margaret replied. "Morrison is finished and he knows it. That's why he's desperate." She was right. By year's end, Morrison's trading post closed. He left Silver Ridge in disgrace, having lost everything trying to undercut prices he couldn't afford to match. Their second winter together brought a different kind of intimacy. Snowbound for weeks at a time, Thomas and Margaret settled into the rhythm of partnership that had deepened into profound love. One evening, as wind howled outside and fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret sat at her desk working on spring projections. Thomas watched her from his chair, mending a harness. "What are you smiling at?" she asked without looking up. "You, us, this life we're building." She set down her pencil and turned to him. "Do you have regrets? About me, I mean?" "Why would you ask that?" "Because I'm not what you pretended I was that day in the chapel. I'm not just the kind woman who helped Billy Henderson. I'm ambitious. I'm calculating. I think about profit margins and market expansion, while other women think about recipes and needlework." Thomas set aside his mending and moved to kneel beside her chair. "Margaret, you think I didn't see that? Your mind is exactly what I fell in love with. Yes, you're kind, but you're also brilliant, strategic, and ambitious. You see possibilities where others see limitations. You turned my small trapping operation into a commercial network that's changing the entire regional economy. Why would I regret marrying the smartest woman in 3 territories?" Tears welled in her eyes. "No one has ever called me smart before. Pretty, definitely not. Useful, occasionally. But smart, never." "Then everyone else was blind," Thomas said firmly. "Margaret, I wake up every day grateful that you chose to build this life with me. Your body houses your brilliant mind and generous heart. Anyone who can't see past the surface doesn't deserve to know the extraordinary woman you are." That night, as they lay together in the sleeping loft, Margaret whispered, "I'm with child." Thomas sat up so quickly he nearly hit his head on the low ceiling. "When did you know?" "I suspected last month. I'm certain now." He pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her belly. "How do you feel about it?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Terrified, excited, worried that I won't be good enough." "Impossible," Thomas murmured against her hair. "You're good enough at everything you do. You'll be an extraordinary mother." In the summer of 1819, news reached their mountain home that Silver Ridge was in crisis. The bank had collapsed, taking most family savings with it. A blight had destroyed much of the wheat crop. The new trading post, never as successful as Morrison's had been, closed entirely. Families were leaving the territory, heading back east or pushing further west to Oregon country. Margaret read the letter from Reverend Matthews, one of the few people in Silver Ridge who'd shown her kindness. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. The baby would come in autumn. "They're suffering," she said quietly. Thomas looked up from the fur samples he was examining. "They earned their suffering. Those people mocked you, humiliated you. Why should we care what happens to them?" "Because holding grudges won't build the world I want our child to inherit," Margaret replied. "And because some people in that town were kind. Mrs. Patterson, who always smiled at me at church. Billy Henderson, who I nursed through his broken leg. Reverend Matthews, who never laughed at the cruel jokes. They're suffering too." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become her home. "Besides, Silver Ridge sits at a crucial junction. If it dies, our entire trading route becomes less efficient. We'd have to reroute through Fort Laramie, adding 3 weeks to every shipment. Saving Silver Ridge isn't just charity, it's good business." Thomas joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What do you propose?" "We make them an offer. We'll invest in rebuilding, but on our terms." In August 1819, Thomas and Margaret rode into Silver Ridge in a fine carriage pulled by matched horses, a far cry from the simple wagon they'd left in 3 years prior. Margaret's pregnancy was obvious now, and she wore a beautiful dress that accommodated her size with elegant grace, designed and sewn by a seamstress in St. Louis. The town had visibly deteriorated. Boarded-up shops lined the main street. The church needed paint. Families sat on porches with the hollow-eyed look of people who'd lost hope. Word spread quickly that the Bridgers had returned. Within an hour, a delegation gathered at the church. Mayor Harrison, Reverend Matthews, and a dozen prominent citizens. Conspicuously absent were the Hardings, Catherine, her husband Edmund, and their daughter Elizabeth. Margaret walked into that church with Thomas at her side, her head held high. The same people who had whispered and laughed 3 years ago now stood with hats in hands, desperation written across their faces. Mayor Harrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Bridger, Mr. Bridger, we've heard of your success in the mountains. Your trading operation has become legendary throughout the territory. He swallowed his pride visibly, we need your help. The bank collapse destroyed most families' savings. Without a functioning mercantile or trading post, we can't access supplies or sell our goods. Families are leaving every week. By winter, Silver Ridge may cease to exist." Margaret looked at each face, remembering. Mrs. Henderson, Billy's mother, who had thanked her years ago but laughed at the wedding. The mayor himself, who had called the marriage a disgrace to the community. Others who had participated in the casual cruelty of that day. "Why should we help you?" Margaret asked quietly. 3 years ago, you made my wedding day into a public humiliation. You mocked my appearance, questioned my husband's judgment, and treated me like a curiosity rather than a person. You bet on how quickly our marriage would fail. Why should I save you now?" The mayor's face reddened, but to his credit, he didn't argue. "We were wrong, cruel, short-sighted. We judged you by your appearance and completely missed your character and capabilities. You became one of the most successful businesswomen in the territory, while we failed at basic commerce. We don't deserve your mercy, but we're asking for it anyway." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice carrying through the church with unexpected authority. "I will help Silver Ridge, but there will be conditions. First, I want a public apology, not just to me, but to every person this community has ever mocked or dismissed based on appearance alone. Second, I want a written charter guaranteeing that no child in this town will ever be excluded from education or opportunity based on their family's finances or their own appearance. Third, anyone who accepts our investment agrees to a strict code of conduct. No gossip, no cruelty, no judgment based on anything but character and action." She paused, then continued, "I will invest $50,000 in rebuilding Silver Ridge. I'll establish a grain processing facility to provide employment and help local farmers. I'll create a credit union offering low-interest loans to families who need to rebuild. I'll fund a new school with trained teachers. But in return, this town will become a model of compassion, fairness, and opportunity. Or I'll watch it die and root my business elsewhere." The church erupted in whispers. $50,000 was an astronomical sum, more than the entire town's annual economic output. Reverend Matthews stepped forward. "Mrs. Bridger, you have more than our agreement. You have my personal commitment to hold this community to those standards." One by one, the townspeople agreed. They signed Margaret's charter, promising to build a different kind of community. All except one family. Catherine Harding watched the proceedings from her window across the street. 3 years ago, she'd been the wealthiest woman in Silver Ridge, wife to the largest landowner in the territory. Now her husband's land was mortgaged beyond recovery. Her savings were lost in the bank collapse, and her pride was all she had left. "I won't do it," she told her husband Edmund. "I won't sign that fat woman's charter and pretend she's some kind of savior. She got lucky marrying a rich trapper. That doesn't make her special." Edmund looked at his wife with tired eyes. "Catherine, that lucky woman built a commercial empire from scratch. She's offering to save this town, including us. Our mortgage is due in 3 months. We'll lose everything if we don't accept her help." "Then we'll lose everything," Catherine said coldly. "I'd rather die poor than bow to Margaret Walsh." Elizabeth Harding, now 21, listened to her parents argue. She remembered organizing that ugliest woman contest at her mother's direction, writing Margaret's name as the predetermined winner. She remembered laughing at the wedding, making cruel jokes about how much food the reception would require. The shame of those memories had grown heavier each year, especially as news of Margaret's success reached them. "Mother," Elizabeth said quietly, "we were wrong about her, about everything." Catherine whirled on her daughter. "Don't you dare take her side. We are Hardings. We don't apologize to anyone, especially not to some obese merchant's daughter who got lucky." But luck had nothing to do with it, and Elizabeth knew it. She'd watched Silver Ridge crumble, while Margaret Bridger built an empire through intelligence, hard work, and vision. The cruel girl who'd mocked Margaret at the wedding had grown into a woman who understood the cost of that cruelty. By September, Margaret's investments began transforming Silver Ridge. The grain processing facility, built on the site of the old trading post, employed 40 men immediately. The credit union opened in a restored storefront, offering loans to farmers and merchants at reasonable terms. Construction began on a new schoolhouse that would serve 50 students. Margaret, now 8 months pregnant, supervised everything from a comfortable chair in the new mercantile she'd established. Thomas worried about her working so hard, but she thrived on the activity. "I'm pregnant, not incapacitated," she told him when he suggested she rest more. "Besides, this is important. We're building something that will last beyond us, a community where our child can grow up without the cruelty I experienced." The transformation wasn't just physical. The charter Margaret had insisted upon changed how people interacted. When young Billy Henderson, now 14, was overheard making fun of a new girl's lisp, Reverend Matthews enforced the community standards. Billy spent 2 weeks working at the grain facility for free, learning the value of respectful labor. When Mrs. Patterson's son, who had learning difficulties, was excluded from study groups, Margaret personally funded a special tutor and made it clear that any further discrimination would result in the family losing access to the credit union. The message spread. Silver Ridge was truly becoming a different kind of town. But the Hardings remained holdouts. Edmund tried repeatedly to convince Catherine to apologize and sign the charter, but she refused. Their mortgage deadline approached relentlessly. Margaret's labor began on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks before the Hardings' mortgage was due. Thomas rode frantically to fetch Dr. Henderson, Billy's father, who'd trained as a physician in Philadelphia before moving west. The doctor arrived to find Margaret remarkably calm, timing her contractions and taking notes between pains. "Mrs. Bridger," Dr. Henderson said with amazement, "you're documenting your own labor." "Someone should," Margaret replied, breathing through another contraction. "Most medical texts are written by men who've never experienced childbirth. I thought accurate records might be useful." The labor was long and difficult. Margaret's size, which had been the source of so much mockery, actually complicated the birth. For 14 hours she struggled while Thomas paced outside, praying to every god he'd learned about from the various tribes he'd traded with. Finally, as sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson, a baby's cry pierced the air. Dr. Henderson emerged, smiling. "You have a daughter. Mother and baby are both healthy." Thomas rushed inside to find Margaret, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. "Thomas, meet Sarah Catherine Bridger." He stared at his wife. "Catherine? After the person I refused to become," Margaret said quietly. "Our daughter will carry that name as a reminder that we choose who we are, regardless of our circumstances or what others expect of us." The Hardings thought Catherine was a name associated with cruelty and pride. Our Sarah will make it mean something else, strength and compassion. Thomas took his daughter carefully, marveling at her tiny perfection. "She has your eyes." "And hopefully your kindness," Margaret murmured, then fell asleep from exhaustion. News of the baby spread through Silver Ridge. Townspeople brought gifts, handmade blankets, carved toys, preserves, and dried goods. Even families with little to spare wanted to contribute, celebrating not just the birth but the woman who'd saved their community. All except one family. The Hardings' mortgage deadline arrived on a cold November morning. Edmund Harding walked alone to the bank, now managed by Margaret's credit union, carrying papers that would surrender his land. His wife had refused to accompany him, still convinced that somehow their pride mattered more than their survival. He found Margaret at her desk, baby Sarah sleeping in a cradle beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral. "Mr. Harding, I expected you might come." Edmund removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. "Mrs. Bridger, I know my wife has been. Catherine has been." He struggled to find words. "We're losing everything today. The land has been in my family for 3 generations. I came to ask, not for charity, but for a loan. I'll work it off however you require. I'll sign your charter. I'll make amends for how we treated you. But please, don't let my family become destitute because of my wife's pride." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "Where is Catherine? Where is Elizabeth?" "Catherine won't come. She says she'd rather lose everything than apologize to you." "Elizabeth," Edmund's voice broke. "Elizabeth wanted to come, but her mother forbade it." "I see." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at Silver Ridge's bustling Main Street, the town she'd saved, the community she'd rebuilt. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, crying on her wedding day while townspeople laughed. She thought about all the times Catherine Harding had specifically targeted her with cruelty, The ugliest woman contest, the loud comments at church, the deliberate exclusion from community events. She thought about forgiveness, about redemption, about what kind of world she wanted Sarah to grow up in. "Mr. Harding, I will offer you a loan at fair terms, enough to pay your mortgage and rebuild your farm operations. In exchange, you will sign the charter and commit to its principles. You will work at the grain facility for 1 year at standard wages, learning the business of honest commerce, and you will require your daughter Elizabeth to come speak with me privately." Edmund's face flooded with relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Bridger. Thank you. But what about Catherine?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Your wife has made her choice clear. She will not benefit from my generosity. I'll extend this offer to you and Elizabeth, but Catherine must find her own path. If she wants to maintain her pride while losing everything, that's her decision. I won't enable it." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the justice in Margaret's condition. "She won't change, you know. Not even this will make her apologize." "Then she'll have to live with the consequences of her choices," Margaret replied. "Just as I've lived with the consequences of mine, which, as it turns out, have been quite favorable." Elizabeth Harding came to see Margaret the next day, her mother having loudly disowned her for betraying the family. The young woman stood in Margaret's office, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve your kindness," Elizabeth said. "I was cruel to you. I helped my mother with that terrible contest. I laughed at your wedding. I was everything wrong with this town." Margaret, nursing Sarah by the window, regarded Elizabeth calmly. "Yes, you were. Do you know what changed you?" Elizabeth wiped her eyes. "Watching you build something beautiful while we destroyed ourselves with spite, seeing how you treated everyone with dignity, even people who hurt you, realizing that beauty and worth have nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character, and my character was ugly even though my face wasn't." "That's honest," Margaret acknowledged. "What do you want, Elizabeth?" "A chance to be better, to learn from you. I don't expect friendship or forgiveness, but I want to be part of building this new Silver Ridge instead of the person who helped destroy the old one." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Can you read and write well?" "Yes, very well. My mother insisted on proper education." "Can you keep accounts? Do mathematics?" "I kept the household books for my father. I'm quite skilled with numbers." Margaret smiled slightly. "Then I have a proposition. My grain facility needs an office manager, someone to handle correspondence, track shipments, manage payroll. The pay is modest, but it's honest work. You'd be learning business operations from the ground up. If you prove yourself capable and trustworthy, there will be opportunities to advance. Are you interested?" Elizabeth stared at her. "You would hire me after everything I did?" "I believe in second chances, Elizabeth. I also believe in practical business decisions. You have skills I need, and you're motivated to prove yourself. That's a good foundation. But understand this. I will hold you to the highest standards. One instance of gossip, one cruel comment, one lapse into the person you used to be, and you're finished. Can you accept those terms?" "Yes." Elizabeth nodded emphatically. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mrs. Bridger. Call me Margaret. If we're going to work together, we should start as we mean to continue, as equals engaged in honest commerce, not as former enemies keeping score." Catherine Harding refused to leave the house for 2 weeks after her husband and daughter betrayed her. She sat in the parlor of their mortgaged home, surrounded by furniture that would soon be repossessed, nursing her wounded pride like a physical injury. When Edmund finally confronted her, he was done being gentle. "Catherine, I've paid the mortgage with money Margaret Bridger loaned me. Elizabeth is working at the grain facility and thriving. Our daughter has a future because she chose to change. You're the only one still clinging to a past built on cruelty and snobbery. What exactly are you fighting for?" "My dignity!" Catherine snapped. "I will not grovel to that woman." There's no dignity in what you're doing, Edmund said quietly. There's just stubborn pride covering up fear. You're afraid to admit you were wrong about Margaret because that would mean admitting you were wrong about everything, about what matters, about how to judge people, about what makes someone valuable. You built your entire identity on being better than others, and Margaret proved that your criteria for better was meaningless. Catherine turned away from him. Get out. I'm not leaving. This is still my house, paid for with money from the woman you refuse to acknowledge. You're living off Margaret Bridger's generosity while pretending you're too good to thank her. That's not dignity, Catherine. That's delusion. He walked to the door, then turned back. I loved who you were when we married, or who I thought you were. But the woman you've become is someone I don't recognize, someone I don't particularly like. Either you change, or you'll be alone. Your choice. Catherine sat alone in the parlor as her husband left. She looked around at the house she'd been so proud of, the possessions she'd accumulated as symbols of status. All of it suddenly felt hollow. She thought about Margaret Walsh, fat, awkward Margaret, who everyone had dismissed, and how that dismissed woman had become Margaret Bridger, the most successful businesswoman in 3 territories. She thought about the grain facility employing half the town, the credit union helping struggling families, the school giving every child a chance at education. She thought about the empire built not on appearance or social status, but on intelligence, hard work, and fundamental human decency. For the first time in her life, Catherine Harding felt genuinely small. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Silver Ridge in snow by late November. The town, now thriving under Margaret's investments, prepared for the cold months with a security it hadn't known in years. The grain facility's warehouses were full, the credit union had helped families stock provisions, and the new school was teaching children by warm stoves. Margaret, adjusting to motherhood while managing her expanding business empire, worked from home most days now. Thomas had suggested hiring a full-time manager for the Silver Ridge operations, but Margaret was particular about the quality of work. Not until we've established the culture properly, she told him. Another year, perhaps. Right now, people need to see that we keep our commitments. Sarah was a happy baby, healthy and alert. Margaret nursed her while reviewing accounts, wrote business correspondence while rocking the cradle with her foot, and somehow managed to make it all look effortless. Thomas marveled at her capacity for juggling responsibilities. One December morning, a knock came at their door. Thomas opened it to find Catherine Harding standing on the porch, snow dusting her shoulders. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by something more than the cold. Mrs. Harding, Thomas said, surprised. What brings you here? I'd like to speak with your wife if she'll allow it. Margaret appeared in the doorway, Sarah in her arms. She studied Catherine for a long moment. Come in, you must be freezing. Inside, Catherine stood awkwardly in the parlor, unable to meet Margaret's eyes. Margaret settled into a chair with Sarah, waiting. Finally, Catherine spoke. I've come to apologize. I know it's years too late. I know words can't undo the cruelty I showed you, but I need to say them anyway. At the face, she took a shaking breath. You were right about everything. You were right about what matters, about how to judge people, about building something meaningful. And I was wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong. I'm sorry. Margaret bounced Sarah gently, considering. What changed, Catherine? Why now? Because holding on to my pride was costing me everything that actually mattered, Catherine said, tears now flowing freely. My husband barely speaks to me. My daughter won't look at me. I sit alone in that house, surrounded by furniture bought with your loan, heated with coal purchased with wages you pay my family, and I finally understood. I've been living off your grace while refusing to acknowledge your humanity. That's not dignity. That's delusion. She wiped her eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for help. My family already has more than we earned. I just needed you to know that I finally see what everyone else has seen for 3 years. You're an extraordinary woman, and I was a fool not to recognize it from the beginning." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Sarah gurgled happily, reaching for her mother's necklace. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Catherine, do you know what the hardest part was? Not the insults about my weight. I'd heard those my whole life. Not the cruel jokes or the betting on how long my marriage would last. The hardest part was knowing that you organized that ugliest woman contest specifically to humiliate me. That was deliberate malice, not just casual cruelty." Catherine's face crumpled. "I know. God help me, I know. But here's what I've learned," Margaret continued, her voice softening. "Holding on to anger toward you wasn't hurting you. It was hurting me. It was making me harder, more cynical, less able to believe in people's capacity to change. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want Sarah to grow up watching her mother nurse grudges and keep score." She stood, still holding Sarah. "I accept your apology, Catherine, and I'll go further. I forgive you. Not because you've earned it, but because I choose to believe people can change. Because the town I'm building here is one where second chances are possible." Catherine stared at her, disbelieving. "Just like that? After everything?" "Not just like that," Margaret corrected. "You had to lose everything before you could see clearly. You had to face real consequences before you could change. That wasn't easy, and I won't pretend it was. But yes, now that you're here, now that you've genuinely acknowledged what you did, I forgive you." Catherine wept openly then, years of pride and denial finally breaking. Margaret handed Sarah to Thomas and wrapped her arms around the woman who had tormented her, holding her while she cried. When Catherine finally composed herself, Margaret said quietly, "The charter still stands, Catherine. If you want to be part of this new Silver Ridge, you're welcome. But you'll have to live by the same standards as everyone else. No special treatment, no returning to old patterns. Can you accept that?" "Yes," Catherine whispered. "Yes, I can. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you." By spring of 1821, Margaret's business network had expanded beyond even her ambitious projections. The grain facility in Silver Ridge was so successful that she opened 2 more in neighboring territories. Her fur trading operation, now managed by a trusted foreman with Thomas overseeing quality control, supplied half the furriers in St. Louis and New Orleans. But Margaret's ambitions reached further. She'd been corresponding with manufacturers in Philadelphia and Boston, exploring possibilities in textile production. The West had abundant wool and leather, but lacked processing facilities. She saw an opportunity. It would require significant capital, she told Thomas one evening, showing him her projections. We'd need to import machinery, train workers, establish new shipping routes. It's risky. Thomas studied the numbers, impressed as always by her thoroughness. How risky? If it fails, we'd lose about a third of our current capital. If it succeeds, we'd triple our annual revenue within 5 years. What does your instinct tell you? Margaret smiled. That the West is growing faster than the East realizes, that within a decade, we'll see a major population shift, that whoever establishes manufacturing capacity now will dominate the market when that shift happens. My instinct says, this is the opportunity we've been building toward. Then we do it, Thomas said without hesitation. I trust your judgment, Margaret. I've trusted it from the beginning, and you haven't been wrong yet. The textile operation launched in summer 1821, employing 60 workers in a new facility just outside Silver Ridge. Margaret recruited experienced workers from back east, offering wages high enough to lure talent west. She established quality standards that made their products competitive with Eastern manufacturers. Elizabeth Harding, who had proven herself an exceptional office manager, became Margaret's assistant director of operations. The young woman had transformed completely, her natural intelligence and organizational skills finally channeled into productive work rather than social manipulation. I should have learned from you years ago, Elizabeth told Margaret one day as they reviewed production reports. All the time I spent worrying about social status and appearances. I could have been developing actual skills, building something meaningful. You're doing it now, Margaret replied. That's what matters. We all start from where we are, Elizabeth, not from where we wish we'd been. In autumn of 1822, 6 years after the wedding that had been turned into public mockery, the mayor of Silver Ridge announced a special town celebration. The occasion, recognizing the Bridgers' contributions to the community's transformation. Margaret initially declined the honor. I didn't invest in Silver Ridge for recognition, she told Reverend Matthews when he came to convince her to accept. I did it because it made business sense and because I wanted Sarah to grow up in a better community. Precisely why we need to honor you, the Reverend replied. You've shown us what real leadership looks like, not seeking glory, but doing what's right and letting the results speak for themselves. Let us celebrate that. Let us show our children what we value. The celebration took place on a perfect October day. The entire town gathered in the square, now paved and landscaped with gardens Margaret had funded. A platform had been erected, decorated with autumn flowers. Margaret stood on that platform, Thomas beside her, 2-year-old Sarah in her arms. She looked out at the transformed town, thriving businesses, employed families, children attending the excellent school. She saw former enemies now living in harmony, united by the community charter she'd insisted upon. Mayor Harrison presented her with a formal proclamation declaring October 15th, Bridger Day, in perpetuity. But it was Catherine Harding's speech that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Catherine stood before the crowd, her voice steady and clear. 6 years ago, I stood in this square and participated in cruelty that shames me to this day. I mocked Margaret Walsh on what should have been the happiest day of her life. I organized competitions designed to humiliate her. I judged her by her appearance and completely missed her character, intelligence, and extraordinary capability. She paused, then continued. Then, Margaret Bridger saved this town when we deserved to fail. She showed us mercy when we'd shown her none. She proved that success comes not from appearance or social status, but from integrity, hard work, and vision. She built an empire by treating people fairly and creating opportunities where others saw limitations. And she did all of this while teaching us, teaching me, what true grace looks like. Catherine's voice broke slightly. I don't deserve her forgiveness, but she gave it anyway. That's who Margaret Bridger is, someone who chooses compassion over revenge, who builds instead of destroying, who sees potential where others see obstacles. Silver Ridge didn't deserve her, but we're grateful she chose to invest in us anyway. The crowd erupted in applause. People were crying openly, not just for Margaret's accomplishments, but for the transformation of their entire community. They'd learned what mattered, had been taught by the woman they'd once dismissed. Margaret stepped forward to speak, and the crowd quieted. 6 years ago, I stood in a church feeling humiliated and judged. I wanted to run away, to hide from the cruelty I'd experienced my entire life. But Thomas, she looked at her husband with love. Thomas saw me, really saw me. Not my appearance, not my social standing, but my character and capability. He gave me a chance to prove what I could do. She shifted Sarah to her other hip. I didn't save Silver Ridge out of charity or even business sense, though both played a role. I did it because I wanted to create a world where children like Sarah never have to experience the kind of judgment I faced. A world where people are valued for who they are, not what they look like. A world where compassion matters more than appearance and character counts more than status. She smiled at the crowd. You've given me that world. Yes, I invested money and created opportunities. But you did the harder work. You changed yourselves. You examined your prejudices, confronted your cruelty, and chose to be better. That transformation is worth more than any business empire. Thank you for building this community with me. The applause this time was thunderous. As Margaret descended from the platform, people lined up to thank her personally, not just for the economic opportunities, but for the moral transformation she had inspired.